Welcome back, students, to this next e-lesson video. This one over Walden and Transcendentalism. As with all of these videos, please feel free to pause and rewind this video at any time to take notes, rewatch, or catch up. And as you learned in the previous video, it's time to start taking notes. Our topics that we're going to talk about with this video, we're going to look at Walden, some of the context behind the book. We're going to talk about Henry David Thoreau, who the author was, and finally the transcendentalism movement, which he was a part of. Let's start with Walden, some of the key facts behind the book. The full title is Walden or Life in the Woods. Books back then used to have alternative titles. It's just need to know that. Written by Henry David Thoreau, of course, published in 1854. This was several years after his experiment living at Walden Pond. It's set at Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, between the summers of 1845 and 1847. So he lived a couple years out there at Walden. The essay's point of view is told from the first person, narrated by Thoreau himself. In fact, he establishes early on in the book, I should not talk so much about myself if there were anybody else whom I knew as well. Finally, the genre of Walden, it is nonfiction, it is a book-length essay, it is autobiographical, and it deals with transcendentalist philosophy. Let's take a look at who Henry David Thoreau was. He was born in Concord, Mass., so he's from that area, back in 1817, and he died in Concord, Mass., his hometown, in 1862 of tuberculosis. He fought tuberculosis for about 3 years toward the end of his life. His parents were relatively cultured people, but they were very, very poor. They understood the value of an education and academics, but they were poor people. They actually made their living by making pencils, they're pencil makers. Henry David Thoreau did receive, however, despite his parents being very poor, he received a top-notch education. Somehow they found a way to send him to Harvard. And I believe he mentions his career at Harvard. In Walden a few times. His first careers, he tried teaching school. He tried teaching, I guess it wouldn't be public school in America at that time, but he tried teaching at traditional schools, but he resigned after a couple of weeks. Other jobs he held, he tried to found his own progressive school with Emerson, I believe, and he also periodically throughout his writing career went back to work the family business of pencil making. And he also worked for a while for the town of Concord as a surveyor dealing with land surveying. Some of his early writing, he was an extensive journaler. He journaled quite a bit. Before he published Walden and the book he published before that, he published essays in the Dial magazine. More on that in a minute. He wrote a lot of nature narratives and poems. So he's one, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, he is one of those poet philosophers from the early 19th century in America. Joining the Transcendentalists, and we'll talk about who the Transcendentalists were and what Transcendentalism is in a minute. But he met Ralph Waldo Emerson in Concord. Ralph Waldo Emerson was the figurehead of the Transcendentalism movement. He met Ralph Waldo Emerson in Concord, his hometown. And Emerson became a sort of mentor to him. Thoreau became Emerson's protege in the Transcendentalism movement. And Emerson was the one who urged Thoreau to contribute essays to the Dial, which was a transcendentalist magazine, a sort of scholarly magazine, not really like a magazine in the sense we think of it today. It wasn't published, but probably twice a year. It was kind of probably like a biannual type of magazine. And it had scholarly essays and poetry in there and literary criticisms and that sort of thing. And it all dealt with, or it all contained the writings of transcendentalists, people in the transcendentalism movement. Thoreau's residence at Walden, he lived at Emerson's estate for a while before moving to before building his little shack at Walden Pond. But it's important to know that his cabin that he talks about building in Walden was actually on Emerson's land. So every time he talks about squatting, which squatting just means to just set up residence illegally on someone else's property, keep in mind that he was squatting on his mentor's land, and he had permission. Some of the common misconceptions surrounding his 2 years spent at Walden. Sometimes in the book he tends to exaggerate his isolation. I don't know if this is so much Thoreau's fault difficult as it is how we talk about Walden, because the thing we remember is Thoreau's experiment living alone in the woods. Well, we tend to exaggerate the isolation because he was within easy walking distance of Concord, easy circa 19th century, probably not easy for us today. We're just not used to walking that far. And he did receive frequent visitors, even his contemporaries, other authors, other members of the Transcendentalist movement would visit him in his little shack on Walden Pond. Thoreau's imprisonment. He was thrown into jail in Concord in 1846 for refusing to pay a poll tax. And he refused to pay this tax because he said that it supports a nation, the tax does. The tax supported a nation that endorsed slavery. He also refused to pay it because he disagreed with the United States' recent engagement in the war with Mexico. He believed that was an illegal war and did not want to support a nation that pursued illegal wars. His reasoning for refusing to pay that poll tax, he works into perhaps his most famous work known to us today, an essay called On Civil Disobedience, which he explains the ethical responsibilities we have toward breaking laws we deem immoral. We'll read that later on in the year. Let's talk about transcendentalism and what the heck transcendentalism is. First of all, transcendentalism was just a philosophical movement and pseudo-religious movement in the early 19th century here in America. And its roots came from this. First of all, it was born out of European romanticism. We'll talk more about what that means in a minute. This European romanticism itself was a rejection of the rationalism of the 18th century, what we call the Enlightenment period. More on that here in a minute. Just know that transcendentalism was a romantic movement. It was a part of romanticism. It was just a specific form of the romantic movement. It was also American intellectuals in this early part of the 19th century. What they wanted a truly American philosophy. Remember, early 19th century, look at what America looked like back then. It was still a relatively young nation. It was still not leading the world in really any category, especially not in the quality of thought that was coming out of America. American writers were not very widely read all over the world. And so American intellectuals wanted to produce a truly American philosophy. They wanted to get on the global map as far as philosophy is concerned. The Transcendentalism movement is heavily influenced by Eastern religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. Thoreau himself, I believe, refers to the Bhagavad Gita in Walden, does he not? If he doesn't, he did. He was very familiar with other Eastern religions as he was writing Walden. I just mentioned how the Transcendentalism movement was born out of European romanticism, so I want to define what I mean by romantic. Our modern concept of romantic is kind of limited. We typically think that romance just means to be, in love with somebody or something like that. That's not really what romantic means. That's just one definition of romantic. This is the broader version of romantic. It's an adjective that means fanciful, impractical, unrealistic, imbued with or dominated by idealism, idealistic ideas, a desire for adventure, deals with chivalry. Anything that is imaginary, fictitious, fabulous, or otherwise fantastic could be called romantic. And so think of romantic as just the opposite of realistic. Yeah, it's the antonym of realistic. That's what we mean in class when we talk about romantic things. And I talked just in that 2 slides ago about how it was an indirect response to, or it was an objection of the Enlightenment or 18th century rationalism. I just wanted to kind of illustrate how that works. The evolution of thought, ever since philosophy has been pursued, so going way back to ancient Greece, thought has evolved, and it always evolves in reaction, in almost complete opposition to some other form of thought. And so I just kind of wanted to show you, it works in a wave, basically. So if in the 17th and 18th century, the philosophies were dominated by rationalism, which you'll hear about in a later video, romanticism, the romantics disagreed with the rationalists. And then here we had, 50 years years later, the realists disagreed with the romantics, and so they started their own movement. And then just 20 or 30 years later, the surrealist movement was in sort of an opposition in a way to the realists, and so on and so forth. So that's just basically how thought evolves. I just wanted to kind of illustrate that. Here's a just kind of a brief illustration on the difference between romanticism and rationalism. Remember, romanticism grew out of an objection to rationalism. Rationalism dominated the 16th and 18th century philosophical thought. Rationalists believed the answers to life, the universe, and everything, all those big philosophical questions, were found through logic and reason. They believed in what they could see and touch and deduce. They would, to them, God only exists philosophically, whereas romantics rejected a lot of what rationalists believed. They believed that those big answers, the answers of life, the universe, and the answers to life, the universe, and everything, could be found through self-reflection and introspection, through looking inside yourself. They believed not in just what they could see and touch, they believed what they could feel and intuit. Their interpretation of God might be something like this: God resides within each one of us and within every tree and stone and gust of wind, kind of like Yoda from Star Wars, that sort of thing. So that's just kind of a quick difference between rationalist thought and romanticist, kind of two very, very opposing philosophies. So let's hammer down the basic beliefs of the transcendentalists. We're going to remember transcendentalism was a romantic movement. So let's talk about some of the basic tenets, their basic philosophies. Transcendentalists believed, first of all, that one should rely more on intuition than on reason to find truth. That is where truth was for them. It wasn't on reason or logic. That the truth that we are looking for is born in all of us the day we are born. It's that intuitive knowledge that we have. That is real truth. They also believe that one should do, not merely think, that one should experience, not merely speculate. They criticize the rationalists for being too detached from actual experience. They also believe that man and nature are inherently good and inherently pure, and that society and its institutions tend to corrupt the purity of the individual. They also believe that one should focus on self-improvement before the improvement of others. We see this in Walden when Thoreau talks about his views on philanthropy, how he doesn't believe in giving charity to someone who's down on their luck, but instead raise them up by helping them, find a job or helping them build skills that they can use to support themselves, those sort of things. And he also, I believe, talks about first, before we can do that, improving ourselves in such a way that we can create a better society for that person. And so, dealing with self-improvement before directly improving others. Finally, the transcendentalist believed that God, or their version of God, manifests himself inside of everyone in the form of divine intuition and inspiration. And this isn't too far from the beliefs of the Unitarian Church, if you're at all familiar with them. Basically just, God is everything that is. God is the universe. God is how nature works, etc. That's their vision of God. Some of the noted transcendentalists, here's some names to throw at you. Ralph Waldo Emerson, I've talked about him. He was the figurehead of the movement. Margaret Fuller, who was the woman who published the Dial magazine, also an excellent writer and philosopher. Theodore Parker, a Unitarian minister who turned transcendentalist, though he still practiced his ministry. Ralph Waldo, or not really a ministry, but he was still he still delivered sermons. It's interesting to note, a lot of these transcendentalists were former Unitarian ministers, Ralph Waldo Emerson included, and Theodore Parker being another. Walt Whitman came along a little bit, or at least in his writings, came along a little bit later, the famous American poet. Guys like Amos Bronson Alcott. There's several more I could throw at you, but we're not going to read any of these people. Nope, not any of them this year. Criticisms of transcendentalism. Of course, it had its critics, being a new philosophical movement in the United States. Edgar Allan Poe, the famous American poet, called it mysticism for mysticism's sake, and thought that, and you can almost see where he's coming from. He thought that the writings of transcendentalist authors were deliberately obscure. So he thought the reason he had trouble understanding Thoreau was because they were being deliberately obtuse. I think that's kind of funny. Robert Louis Stevenson, the Scottish author, called them self-indulgent, keeping their virtues to themselves, and they kind of were in a way. I can't argue with that. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous American writer, said that Thoreau specifically said this. He said, Thoreau repudiated all regular modes of getting a living and seems inclined to lead a sort of Indian life among civilized men. Kind of a get-a-job criticism there from Thoreau. All right. I've got a couple of additional videos. I know this is a big subject to tackle, and so I put a couple of additional videos out there on the course site on this e-lesson. The first one is a 4-minute video. David Shee, a professor of history, I believe at University of Virginia, does a really cool 4-minute video just on rationalism, romanticism, and transcendentalism. And then finally, I've got the Crash Course Market Revolution video. If you're unfamiliar with the Crash Course series, watch the video. You will be sufficiently entertained and you'll learn something. All right, that's it for this e-lesson video over Walden and Transcendentalism. Thank you for watching. Feel free to watch again, and I'll see you in class.